Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Reverend Dr. Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
Welcome to tonight's address when I'm talking about priorities for Christian leadership. There are two reasons for doing that. One, because that theme in itself is important, but also it fits into very much a church seeking to find its way forward and discover what it is to be a community of faith. We turn to the Epistle of Peter, and we recognize that it's written to a suffering church. You can't really read Peter without feeling that underneath and woven into all its words an awareness that there is a church under pressure. The date has generally been linked to the persecution under Nero, about AD 64. That's written in a letter to Clement in AD 96 that kind of articulates the pressure that the church was under. But it's written not only to encourage and to comfort, but also to prepare the church. And therefore, I think we can read it not only as a reflection on history and say, at a certain point in time, the Christian church was under pressure, but to say we always ought to be asking ourselves, how is it that we are a church and how it is we behave under such situations? Of course, the pressure that we face is very, very different than the earliest church, but it's just as real. If there's a key verse to 1 Peter, it has to be chapter 3 and verse 15. But in your hearts reveal Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope you have. So Peter is really saying that we as the church have to be able to witness to Christ even in the circumstances that we find ourselves in. I think 1 Peter excels as a pastoral letter for what it has to say. It's a model, if you like, of pastoral charge. Its excellent lies not only in its very effective pastoral theology, its understanding of God through the eyes of pastoral life, but also in the manner in which it's conveyed. I sense a humble transparency throughout it, and it's a useful starting point for any ministry, mission, congregational life, any exploration of what it is that we should be. And vital to the health of every and any congregation, whatever size, large or small, is the vitality of its leadership. And by its leadership, we don't simply mean clerics and preachers, but those people who help to give shape to what we are today. Pressure upon any group of people can eventually make it come apart at the seams, but not if there is at the heart of it that leadership that will keep it sound. The truth which every Christian leader has to come to terms with, it's often Christians who are under scrutiny and criticism. And that was certainly true in the life of the early church. And Peter, it seems to me, may well be encouraging the church to stand together as one. Kendrick's song that we sang a few minutes ago, Graham Kendrick picks up that thought of belonging and believing together as a community that truly is one. When we study this passage, the theme of leadership is seen to almost be sandwiched between two sections on suffering. Now, I find that interesting. I think Peter is well aware, perhaps above all the disciples, and will learn himself maybe in a very short period of time, that the cost of leadership may well be suffering in one form or another. Now, I don't want to concentrate on who the elders are, but I do want to draw your attention to 2 points, which will feed into all that we shall look at in the next few minutes. Firstly, Peter calls himself a fellow elder. I think that's an interesting take. He's talking to elders, but he talks to them as a fellow elder. So this is not a message from over above, it's a message from alongside. I think that's very, very helpful in understanding not only Peter, but leadership. And a pastor alongside pastors giving helpful advice. It's a good pattern. To be effective, I think, as far as Peter is concerned, you need to be in touch with Christ. There needs to be a vitality of relationship with him that will make sense of all other leadership. And when you compare the different churches of the New Testament and what they had to go up against, it's worth reminding ourselves of some of the pressures that were there in some of the other churches. I think of Corinthians being an interesting church. Chapter 3, verses 5 to 7. This is the church and its leadership there. What, after all, is Apollos? And what is Paul? Only servants through which you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. So neither the one that plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes it grow. In the wider context, we hear sometimes people talking about ministry and mission. You sometimes hear people saying, I'm offering to serve abroad. And it sounds very good, really, as a statement. But the truth is, all service begins in calling. It begins in spiritual vocation and purpose. And then opening ourselves open to the possibility of where it is that God should lead us, wherever that might be, may well follow. The text is 1 Peter chapter 5, 2 to 3. Be shepherds of God's flock that's under your care, watch over them, not because you must, but because you're willing, as God wants you to be, not pursuing honest gain, but eager to serve, not lording over those entrusted to you, but by being examples to the flock. I don't think anybody who's a leader can hear what Peter is saying here and say, oh gosh, yes, that's definitely what we do. The reality is that there's an uncomfortability that is a necessity for anybody who has leader. And before we look at the nature of what it means to be a leader, let me make a couple of points that I think are important. The appointment of leaders is always related, certainly for Peter, in relation to the shepherds. And secondly, they are those who are fulfilling, standing in the long tradition of those who have gone before. The pastoral care of the shepherd is not impersonal. You can't help but read John chapter 10 to see Jesus talk about that ministry of the shepherd. And the shepherd is as God's flock, not ours. If ever we view a congregation, this comes back to our looking about what our congregation should be moving forward. It's not our congregation, it's God's congregation. I think it's enormously important to grasp that in every way in our sense. What we have in these verses from Peter's first epistle are words that help us to understand leadership in relation to God's church. As we open the verses up, we find three specific characteristics for the motivation that lies behind us as leaders in the Christian community, in the pastoral setting, in the church setting. Specific gifts, I think, that are there if we need to live in relation to that. Firstly, we care, not because we must, but because we're willing. Now, I think that we're all aware of motivation matters in almost every area of life. Well, it matters here too. We care not because we must, but because we're willing. There's a danger to be found in that attitude that says, I'm doing this because I have to. I'm doing this because somebody ought to do it. Now, the second can lead into real purpose, but there is something more profound, I think, that Peter is pointing to. Because we are willing, we are open, we are ready. We're ready to place our hands into the hands of God and to do that which he calls us to. As preachers of the gospel, it'd be very interesting if we had a manuscript and we were to look at it and say, now we're going to circle every time we see the word must, every time we see the word ought, and every time we see the word should. Now, that's not to say that preachers of the gospel ought not to ever say those things, but I think Peter here is pointing to something else. He's pointing to an openness, a readiness to serve God, and suggesting that we are not only those who care because it's there to do, but because we feel we are willing to do whatever it is that God calls us to. Our ministry, our mission, our service, whether it is as lay people or as leaders, begins and ends in calling. and God's purposes. Let's be quite clear that in all leadership, the church hasn't always got this right. You remember what the press gangs were in the Northern Hemisphere when they needed people to serve. They would say, we need 44 on the ship that's leaving tomorrow from Southampton. You know, you can come and take the king's shilling if you like and join the ship. And people were press ganged. Well, I know church can feel a bit like that sometimes. You know, we need somebody to do a job, will you do it? But essentially, we do not do things because we've been press ganged into it, but because somehow flowing from us is a willingness to serve God. Peter understood this in a very profound way in terms of his own life. Go back to, you can study the gospel, I think, through the ministry of Peter. There's a very good reason for doing that in Mark's gospel, because it seems to me that Peter lies behind Mark in presenting that story. May well be the secretary that gives all the information and the detail for that which he presents to us. But you can go with Peter to his lakeside calling and understand that there needs to be something within him that makes that call, that willingness to be a fisher of people, only because he is open to that happening. We can see him journey through the painful experiences of his denial. Those moments when he denied the Lord and he wept bitterly and deeply because of the pain that was there. We can see it in his lakeside reinstatement. This is the gospel through Peter, which is an enormously powerful story. And then, of course, we see the gospel at Pentecost, when Peter stands up and all the disciples stand up with him, recognizably the leader, declaring the good news and seeing that marvelous harvest of 3,000 fish, no people. Marvelous response, all coming from one man who not only commended this thought to those who were recipients of his letter as a church under pressure, but demonstrated in his own life. All leadership goes through ups and downs. Nobody knows that more than I do. It's part of life. It's part of life that is challenging and demanding. And yet sometimes our humanity gets in the way of the calling. And the reality of the calling here that Peter is suggesting for all those who are to be there, it's something that's a rare commodity. It's that willingness to do, that willingness to be, that willingness to serve. And I think that's important. For me personally, I, as a preacher, and I won't be the only person that has this dilemma, that I have lots of calls at one and the same time. There is the call, firstly, and I want to call this the most important call in a person's life, the call to be a Christian. The call to be a follower of Jesus. Now, I can only believe that that's real in your life if you belong to a community or if you belong to a congregation. The first call is something all of us can share. For me, the second call has been the call to be a preacher and finally to be a leader within the life of the church and community. But they all operate like a mobile, informing each other in understanding and depth. John Ruskin once commented on a lamplighter on a picture. You know, the old lamplighter used to go around the towns, lighting the lamps in the villages and towns to make it right. And Ruskin pointed to this picture of the lamplighter. And the lamplighter was walking up a hill. And he said, that's what I mean by being a real Christian. You can trace their course by the number of lights that they are responsible for. And one by one, Ruskin saw this lamplighter climbing the hill and said that helps to define who they are. So the things we do, what we feel we're called to, our response to God. Secondly, we care not because we're greedy for money, writes Peter, but because we're eager to serve. So again, this is about motivation, but I think it's much more directed now to the purpose that explodes from our lives. Paid ministry is not an invention of the modern church, but it has in it many, many dangers that all of us recognize. Some leaders in the New Testament were released from paid employment so they could serve the life of the church. And Peter knew that that was the case. And so he picks up that thought that you find in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and Luke chapter 10. You can find plenty of biblical material in this particular area. He says, a payment is no reason for serving. Even those who are paid do not serve because they are paid. They are paid and they serve. The two things must not be too intricately bound together. And a Christ-centered vision must be the purpose for all our ministry. The eagerness with which we serve is a determining feature of whether our ministry is truly in Christ. The eagerness, the enthusiasm, the passion. Call it the passion, shall we? Whatever we are passionate about. That's something that embodies our life in Christ. Some of the most significant ministry goes on without recognition. It goes on without people ever being aware of what is happening and what is going on. However, we continue because it's not that kind of shallow, emotionally led eagerness that drives us, but a deep-seated sense of call. My church history lecturer, when he was talking about Samuel Chadwick, once said this, that Chadwick said, I would rather pay to preach than be paid not to. And he said, when you unpack that, you'll find what he's really saying and what is the essential calling of his life. Not very long ago, I read of a writer who was walking past a tattoo parlor in a Southeast Asian country. He stopped and looked at all the various designs. I don't go to the tattoo shops, but I'm told that they've got their list of all the things you can have on there. I Love Lucy and all the other stuff that's there. But they're much more sophisticated, I'm told, today. And one of the tattoos that was on the wall had these words, born to lose. Born to lose. And it fascinated the writer. So much so he went into the shop and asked the tattooist, how many people choose that? Born to lose. He said, well, actually, earlier today, I tattooed born to lose all across a man's chest. I mean, he's cringing at the thought of this, what this is like. He said, why? To the owner of the shop. And the owner of the shop said this, before the tattoo is put on the chest, the tattoo has to be in the mind. And I think he was driving at something quite, well, almost bizarre, but true. That deep down, the things that mark us out and drive us are deep-seated. And though most of us won't be sharing our tattoos after the service in the theatre, all of us are driven by things that mark out our lives. We are born to serve, not born to lose, and we're eager to do so. It's the centre of all our authenticity, the eagerness to do. And then moving on, and coming to this third aspect, we care not by exercising power over others by being examples. This is very tough, but it's true. And we all, whoever has to exercise power, know this is very challenging. Peter said, not lording over those entrusted to you, but by being examples to the flock. There are an increasing number of books on secular leadership models, and they're not all nonsense. They're useful to read, but we put them as Christian people through the prism of our understanding of Christ. They're not top-down models alone. There's something far more profound than all of that. And such different attitudes are difficult to align with a specific take on Christianity. No force or manipulation on the part of Christian leaders, but by the quality of lifestyle, which impacts powerfully upon a community and a congregation. If we are to grow, and if we are to be a church that is ready for the next decade or so, then we will be those who want to explore what it means to how do we grow leadership. And how do we develop that? And how do we demonstrate that? And so many other things linked to that thought. People are more likely to follow the kind of leader who leads by example, do what I do rather than what I say. But the leaders who do not say what is needed may sometimes be very popular, but not transformative. It is possible to have many good things and to do the right things and be there, but there are times when we have to say, this is the way, let us walk in it together. That's what we expect. Lifestyle is key to most aspects of effective ministry. I'm aware that in addition to the traditional values of ministry I'm expounding, we need to add to it many other things. We need as leadership to be able to communicate with those in the life of the church, to not see communication as merely the one who communicates the preached word, but actually communicates what it means for us to be a community of faith, a community alive together. Power can be exercised in all kinds of ways, but it's a subject that together we ought to be able to explore. It's rare but not impossible for a great leader not to possess appropriate administrative skills. It's rare for a congregation to exist without any understanding of how we organize ourselves. We have to explore what does that mean for us, where we are today, to be a church engaged and organized for the purposes of Jesus. Jesus demonstrated a servant style of ministry entrusted to us. The word example is the root meaning of die or stamp. So when we talk about Jesus and our discipleship being an example, it's like that which is stamped upon. And the great thing about a stamp, of course, is the glory of a stamp is that it is put on the envelope and it serves its purpose when it gets to its destination. It never loses its purpose. It's no good picking it up and saying, I don't know what this is all about. It's about a destination and a purpose. The leader's reward is always going to be spiritual. It's always going to be something deep. We serve not grudgingly, but willingly. We serve not greedily, but eagerly. We serve not arrogantly, but as examples. And the whole area of ministry is to be understood within the orbit of accountability. We're required to give an account of our leadership. That's why I think it's that these wonderful words towards the end of this section that was read to us in 1 Peter chapter 5 talks about when the chief shepherd appears, you'll receive the crown of glory. There will be a time in which we give accountability for what it is that we do as leaders within the life of the Christian community. Faithful leaders will receive a crown of glory that does not fade away. From time to time now in my long ministry, I've discovered some members of a church or a Christian community have had a disagreement with their minister. They've had words with a deacon, a church leader, or whatever. Sooner or later, the issue at stake, which is more often than not small in origin, is sorted out. However, unhealthy feelings often remain, which need to be dealt with. And I think when I read Peter talking about leadership, he's not talking on the surface alone. He's talking deeply about leadership. He's talking deeply about the life of the church. Not simply something we do, but something we are. Not something that is something that we hope to design and get into the right shape, but something that God helps us to shape the kind of people we are. A number of years ago, a quite incredible incident occurred in the Midlands of England, in Birmingham. A 2-year-old child, Joel Towie, was found floating lifeless on a pond. He was brought back to life after 7 hours of heart massage. And he owed his life to medical skill and cold water in equal measures. You will know that cold water sometimes stops the body and puts the body into a place of suspense, we might call it. to allow that which happened in this particular case. And such a story reminds me that not everything that appears at first to be lifeless is lifeless. And sometimes the most lively things, the most vibrant things, the things that will bring shape to the church come from unlikely places, in unlikely people, at unlikely times. And I think that's worth holding in our mind as we think about the church. In my early 20s, the film Jaws kept movie theatre lovers in cinemas and away for the beaches for months in equal measure. People were held on the edge of their seats and an occasional jump in the theatre to boot. Imagine if just before the dum-dum, dum-dum, yeah, you've seen it. Just before that music begins for the first time, somebody comes on screen and says, "You're about to witness a huge shark running amok and terrorizing a coastal town called Amity. Don't worry, before it's all over, the bad shark will get blown up by the sheriff, Brody. Now sit back and enjoy the movie." That didn't happen, of course, because we don't know, we can't know the end of the stories of life, except to say that those stories are hidden with Christ in God, that God's purposes calls together a community in faith. I think it was David Bosch, who is brilliant at some of the writings that he has, who captures the dilemma of the modern church in this way, especially the church in the developed world. He wrote, "Strictly speaking, one ought to say that the church is always in a state of crisis, and its greatest shortcoming is that only occasionally do we become aware of it." Now, Bosch pushes me back when he says that. But I think that there's more than a touch of truth in that. That in each and every age, we ought to ask deep and profound questions about how we see the shape of the church moving forward. If we manage to set correctly the biblical pattern of leadership and character and spirituality, what a difference that would make. It would motivate us afresh to mission and ministry. It would bring new focus for unity. And most of all, it would exalt Jesus. For all of us, our vision of this church that we long to see built, that has been pictured up in our songs tonight, which is in our hearts, in our longing, in our desire. The greatest thing about it is that when Jesus Christ builds his church, it brings glory to God. And may that happen amongst us this night and always.